Hey guys, welcome back to Fantasy Hub. Today's story is one of my favorites.
My name is Annabelle, and 6 months ago, I was drowning. Not literally, though some nights it felt like it, but financially, emotionally, spiritually. My sister Sarah had been fighting cancer for 2 years, and the medical bills were eating. Use alive, insurance covered the basics, but the experimental treatment she needed, that was going to cost us everything we didn't have. I'd sold my car, my jewelry, even my grandmother's wedding dress. I was working 3 jobs and sleeping 4 hours a night, and it still wasn't enough. The doctors gave Sarah 3 months without the treatment. With it, they gave her hope. Hope costs $40,000, apparently. That's when Mrs. Patterson from down the street mentioned Trinity Blackwood. She runs that little antique shop on Maple Street. Mrs. Patterson had whispered over her garden fence, her voice carrying that tone people use when they're about to tell you something deliciously scandalous. They say she can make things worth more than they are, if you catch my meaning. I caught her meaning, all right. I just wasn't sure I was desperate enough to act on it. But desperation has a way of making decisions for you. The bell above. Trinity's shop door chimed like a death knell when I walked in that first afternoon. The place smelled of old wood and secrets, filled with furniture that looked like it had stories to tell, some of them probably true. Trinity emerged from the back room like she'd been expecting me, all sharp angles and knowing smiles. She was beautiful in that dangerous way that makes smart women do stupid things. Dark hair pulled back in a messy bun, wearing a vintage band. T-shirt that probably cost more than my rent, and hands that move like they were conducting an invisible orchestra. When she looked at me, I felt like she could see right through to the desperation I was trying so hard to hide. "You're not here for the furniture," she said, and it wasn't a question. "I have some family heirlooms," I started, then stopped. The lie felt clumsy in my mouth. "I need them to be worth more than they are." Trinity's smile could have cut glass. "No, that's honest. I like honest. It's rare in my line of work." She led me to the back room, past curtains that felt like crossing, into another world. The workshop was a maze of half-finished projects, tools I couldn't identify, and the kind of organized chaos that spoke of a brilliant mind at work. Trinity gestured for me to sit on a stool that probably belonged in a museum. "Show me what you've got," she said, pulling on a pair of reading glasses that made her look like a sexy librarian who moonlighted as a cat burglar. I pulled out the vase, a simple ceramic piece my grandmother had left me, worth maybe $50 at a garage sale. Trinity took it in her hands like it was made of spun gold, turning it over, examining every inch with the intensity of a surgeon. She murmured, running her fingers along the base. "Provincial pottery, probably 1970s, mass-produced, but ... She looked up at me, and I saw the first spark of what would become our undoing. With the right documentation, the right provenance, this could be late 18th century, French country estate, very collectible. How much?" I asked, though I already knew I'd pay whatever she asked. "My usual fee is 30% of the sale price, but for you." She set the vase down carefully, then leaned back against her workbench. "I think we can work something out." The way she said it made my stomach flutter in a way that had nothing to do with nerves. Trinity was a teacher, I learned. A patient, thorough teacher who took genuine pleasure in sharing her craft. Over the next 2 weeks, I found myself spending hours in her workshop, watching her work magic with tea stains and candle wax, learning the difference between genuine aging and the kind of artificial wear that screamed fake to anyone with half a brain. "The key," she explained, carefully applying a mixture of coffee and vinegar to a piece of paper, "is to understand that authenticity isn't about perfection. It's about believable imperfection." She showed me how to create convincing documentation auction, records, insurance appraisals, letters of authentication that looked like they'd been gathering dust in someone's attic for decades. Her computer was a museum of fonts, her printer could make paper look like it had survived 2 world wars, and her hands, God, her hands could make lies look like truth. "You're a natural," she said one afternoon, watching me carefully age the edges of a fake provenance letter with a lighter. "Most people are too heavy-handed. They want everything to look ancient, but real age is subtle. It whispers, it doesn't shout." I was concentrating so hard on not burning the paper that I didn't notice her moving closer until her breath was warm my neck. The scent of her perfume, something expensive and mysterious, mixed with the smell of old wood and chemicals, creating an intoxicating cocktail that made my head spin. "Like this," she murmured, her hand covering mine as she guided the flame. "Gentle, patient. You have to seduce the paper into believing it's old." The double meaning wasn't lost on me. I was being seduced to, drawn into her world of beautiful lies and profitable deceptions. When she spoke about her work, her eyes lit up like other people's did when they talked about their children or their faith. This was her art, her passion, her calling. "Why do you do it?" I asked one evening as we worked side by side, the workshop lit only by the warm glow of desk lamps. "I mean, you're obviously talented. You could do anything." Trinity was quiet for a long moment, her hands never stopping their careful work on what would become my grandmother's authentic 18th century vase. "You ever notice how the art world is full of pieces that only the wealthy can afford? Museums hoarding treasures behind glass, private collectors buying up history and hiding it in their mansions?" She paused, looking up at me with those dark eyes that seemed to see everything. "I'm redistributing wealth in my own small way, taking money from people who have too much and giving it to people who need it. Like you." "That's a very romantic way to describe fraud," I said, but I was smiling. "I prefer creative reallocation of resources," she replied, and her smile was pure sin. "Besides, who's really getting hurt? Some rich collector gets a beautiful piece for their collection. You get the money you need to save your sister. I get to practice my craft and pay my bills. Everyone wins." It was a rationalization, of course. I knew that even then. But when you're drowning, you don't question the life preserver someone throws you. You just hold on and hope it doesn't sink. The auction house was everything I'd imagined and more. Crystal chandeliers cast rainbows across polished floors, and the air hummed with the kind of money that didn't have to announce itself. Trinity had coached me on how to dress, how to speak, how to carry myself like I belonged in a world where people spent more on a single purchase than most people made in a year. "Remember," she'd whispered as we walked up the marble steps, "you're not selling a fake, you're selling a story. The story of your grandmother's French estate, the story of how this piece survived wars and revolutions, the story of why you're reluctantly parting with it now." The story was beautiful, I had to admit. According to the documentation Trinity had created, the vase had belonged to the Duchess of Montclair, had been hidden during the French Revolution, had survived the Nazi occupation of France, and had finally made its way to my grandmother through a romantic liaison with an American soldier after the war. It was the kind of provenance that made collectors' hearts race and wallets open. Marcus Diaz was the kind of man who made my skin crawl the moment I saw him. Perfectly groomed, expensively dressed, with the kind of smile that said he knew exactly how much everything cost and exactly how much he could get away with. He circled the vase like a shark, his fingers trailing along its surface with an intimacy that made me want to snatch it away from him. "Extraordinary piece," he murmured, his voice oil-slick smooth. "The craftsmanship is exceptional, and the provenance, well, it reads like a novel." "My grandmother never liked to talk about the war," I said, sticking to the script Trinity had drilled into me. She said some stories were too painful to tell, but she treasured this piece. Said it reminded her of better times. Marcus nodded, his eyes never leaving the vase. I can see why. It's a remarkable survivor. Like your grandmother, I'm sure. The bidding started at 5,000. I watched, my heart hammering, as the price climbed higher and higher. 10,000, 15, 20. At 25,000, there were only two bidders left, Marcus and an elderly woman in pearls who looked like she'd stepped out of a merchant ivory film. Trinity squeezed my hand, her touch the only thing keeping me anchored to reality. This was really happening. We were really going to pull this off. 30,000, Marcus called out, his voice calm and confident. The woman in pearls hesitated, her paddle wavering. For a moment, I thought she might bid again, might push the price even higher. But then she shook her head, and the auctioneer's gavel came down with a finality that made my knees weak. Sold to bidder number 47 for $30,000. $30,000. Enough for Sarah's treatment, enough to save her life, enough to make all of this worthwhile. I should have felt relief, joy, triumph. Instead, I felt something else entirely, a dark thrill that had nothing to do with the money and everything to do with the woman whose hand was still wrapped around mine. We'd done it. We'd actually done it. The champagne was expensive, the kind that came in bottles with names I couldn't pronounce and price tags that made my eyes water. Trinity had insisted on celebrating, had dragged me to one of those intimate wine bars where the lights were low, and the music was just loud enough to give you privacy without drowning out conversation. To successful partnerships, she said, raising her glass with that smile that made my stomach do backflips. To desperate measures, I replied, and we both laughed, the sound bright and reckless in the dim bar. The money had been transferred. That afternoon, $30,000 minus Trinity's fee and the auction house's commission, $21,000. Enough to pay for Sarah's treatment with some left over for the mountain of bills that had been accumulating like storm. Clouds on my kitchen table. I should have been happy. I should have been relieved. Instead, I felt like I was standing on the edge of a cliff, looking down into an abyss that was both terrifying and irresistible. So what now? I asked, twirling the champagne in my glass. I go back to my normal life? 3 jobs and 4 hours of sleep? Trinity steadied me over the rim of her glass, her dark eyes unreadable. Is that what you want? The question hung between us like a challenge. What did I want? A week ago, I would have said I wanted Sarah to get better, wanted the bills to be paid, wanted to go back to the simple life I'd had before cancer turned everything upside down. But now, sitting in this dimly lit bar with a woman who made forgery look like fine art, I realized I wanted something else entirely. I wanted to feel alive again. I wanted to feel dangerous. I wanted to feel like I mattered in a world that seemed determined to grind me into dust. Maybe I want to learn more, I said finally. About the business, about the art. Trinity's smile was slow and predatory. I was hoping you'd say that. She leaned closer, her voice dropping to a whisper that made my pulse race. I have another project. Bigger than the vase. More complicated. More. She paused, searching for the right word. Lucrative. What kind of project? A painting. Supposedly by a minor French impressionist. The kind of piece that could sell for 6 figures if it had the right documentation. The right story. She sat back, studying my face. The kind of project that would require a partner. Someone with your particular talents. What talents? I asked, though I was already leaning in, already caught in her web. You're believable, she said simply. When you tell a lie, people want to believe it. That's a gift, Annabelle. A very valuable gift. The rational part of my mind screamed warnings. This was how it started, how good people got pulled into bad situations. One small compromise led to another, and before you knew it, you were in so deep you couldn't find your way back to the surface. But the rational part of my mind had been overruled by desperation weeks ago. Now it was being overruled by something else entirely, a hunger I hadn't even realized I possessed. Tell me more, I said, and Trinity's smile was like watching the sunrise over a battlefield. The painting was beautiful, I had to admit. A landscape of the French countryside, all soft colors and gentle light, signed with a flourish that looked authentically period. Trinity had acquired it through channels she didn't specify, and had learned not to ask too many questions about her sources. Henry Dubois, she explained, pointing to the signature. Minor impressionist, worked in the 1880s, genuine pieces. By himself for anywhere from 50 to 200,000, depending on the size and subject matter. And this one? This one is a very good fake. Probably painted in the 1960s by someone with real talent but no fame. The technique is right, the materials are right, but the provenance is non-existent. She turned to me, her eyes bright with mischief. That's where you come in. The story we created was more elaborate than the vase, more intricate and more dangerous. According to our documentation, the painting had been purchased by my great-aunt Margaret during a trip to Paris in 1953. She'd bought it from a small gallery that specialized in rediscovered works pieces that had been lost or forgotten and were just coming back to market. Trinity was a master at creating the paper trail. Gallery receipts, shipping records, insurance appraisals from the 1950s, all carefully aged and artificially weathered to look like they'd been stored in an attic for decades. She even created a fake obituary for the gallery owner, making it impossible for anyone to verify the story through direct contact. The key to a good con, she explained as we worked late into the night, is to give people just enough information to fill in the blanks themselves. Let them convince themselves that your story is true. I was getting better at the technical aspects, the aging, the documentation, the careful attention to detail that made lies look like truth. But more than that, I was getting better at living. In the world Trinity had created, the world where rules were suggestions and morality was negotiable. You're a natural, she said one night, watching me carefully distress a shipping label with sandpaper. Most people struggle with the moral implications. They want to justify what they're doing, want to make it noble somehow. And I don't. You understand that sometimes survival requires flexibility. That sometimes doing the wrong thing is the only way to do the right thing. She paused, studying my face in the lamplight. Your sister's responding well to the treatment? I nodded. Sarah had started the experimental therapy 2 weeks ago, and the initial results were promising. The doctors were cautiously optimistic, which in medical speak meant they were practically doing cartwheels. Then you understand the cost of moral purity, Trinity said softly. Sometimes the only way to save someone is to damn yourself a little. She was right, of course. But I was beginning to realize that damnation felt a lot like liberation. Marcus Diaz appeared at Trinity's shop on a Tuesday morning like a bad omen, an expensive suit. I was in the back room, working on aging a letter of authentication, when I heard the bell chime and Trinity's voice take on that particular tone she used when she was trying to charm someone who made her nervous. Mr. Diaz, she said, and I could hear the smile in her voice even through the curtain. What an unexpected pleasure. Ms. Blackwood, he replied, his voice carrying that oily confidence that made my skin crawl. I was hoping we could have a little chat. I crept closer to the curtain, my heart hammering. Through the gap, I could see Marcus examining the shop with the kind of thoroughness that suggested he wasn't just browsing. Trinity stood behind the counter, her posture casual, but alert like a cat watching a dog that hadn't decided whether to attack. I've been thinking about that vase, Marcus said, running his fingers along the edge of a genuine Victorian writing desk. The one your charming associate sold at auction last month? It was a lovely piece, Trinity replied carefully. I'm sure it looks wonderful in your collection. Oh, it does. It does indeed. Marcus turned to face her, his smile sharp enough to cut. In fact, it looks so wonderful that I decided to do a little research. You know how it is with collectors. We love a good story. My blood turned to ice. I pressed closer to the curtain, straining to hear every word. The story was fascinating, Marcus continued, his voice taking on a predatory quality. The Duchess of Montclair, the hidden treasure, the romantic soldier. It read like something out of a novel. So I contacted a friend of mine in Paris, a specialist in French decorative arts, asked him to look into the Duchess's collection. Trinity's knuckles were white where she gripped the counter, but her voice remained steady. And he found it very interesting that the Duchess of Montclair never existed. Nor did the chateau where she supposedly lived. Nor, for that matter, did the American soldier who supposedly brought the vase to America. Marcus's smile was pure venom. Fascinating how an entire history can be created from nothing, don't you think? The workshop was so quiet I could hear my own heartbeat. Trinity and Marcus stared at each other like gunfighters in an old western, each waiting for the other to make the first move. That is fascinating, Trinity said finally. Of course, records from that period can be spotty. Wars have a way of destroying documentation. They do indeed, Marcus agreed, which is why I was so surprised when I had the vase examined by a specialist yesterday. You know what he found? He didn't wait for an answer. Machine marks. Microscopic. Tool marks that are consistent with modern production techniques. The kind of marks that wouldn't exist on a piece made in the 18th century. He leaned forward, his voice dropping to a whisper. The kind of marks that would exist on a piece made in the 1970s and artificially aged. I felt like I was going to throw up. We'd been caught. Our beautiful, elaborate con had been exposed, and now we were going to pay the price. But Trinity just smiled. How interesting, she said, her voice carrying a dangerous edge. I hope you didn't pay too much for that examination, because if you're suggesting that I was involved in selling a fraudulent piece, I think you should know that I have no legal obligation to authenticate items that other people bring to auction. Is that so? It is. You see, I'm an antique dealer, not an appraiser. When Miss Henderson brought that vase to me, she was simply asking for help with research and documentation. I provided that help based on the information she gave me. If that information was incorrect, double quotes, she shrugged elegantly. Well, that's hardly my fault. Marcus's face was turning red, though Trinity wasn't finished. Of course, if you truly believe the piece is fraudulent, you're welcome to contact the authorities. I'm sure they'd be very interested in your collection. All of it. I imagine they'd want to authenticate every piece very thoroughly. The threat hung in the air like smoke. Marcus's flush deepened, but his smile faltered. I realized what Trinity was doing. She was calling his bluff, betting that he had his own secrets to hide. You're a clever woman, Miss Blackwood, he said finally. But cleverness can be dangerous in the wrong hands. Is that a threat, Mr. Diaz? It's an observation. He straightened his tie, his composure returning. I'll be watching you, both of you. And if I find any evidence of fraud, any evidence at all, I'll make sure you pay for it. He turned and walked out, the bell chiming his departure like a funeral. Dirge. Trinity stood frozen behind the counter for a long moment, then slowly sank into a chair. Well, she said finally, that was unpleasant. I emerged from the back room on shaking legs. What do we do now? Trinity looked up at me, and I saw something in her eyes I'd never seen before. Fear. Real, genuine fear. Now we lay low, she said, And we hope that Marcus Diaz has enough skeletons in his own closet to keep him quiet. Laying low was harder than I'd expected. For 3 weeks, I tried to go back to my normal life, but normal felt like a costume that no longer fit. I went to work, visited Sarah at the hospital, paid bills with money that still felt stolen despite all of Trinity's rationalizations. But every knock at the door made my heart race. Every phone call made me wonder if this was the moment everything came crashing down. Sarah was getting better. The experimental treatment was working, slowly but steadily shrinking the tumors that had been stealing her life. She had color in her cheeks again, energy in her voice, hope in her eyes. The doctors were talking about remission, about a future that stretched beyond the next few months. "I don't know how you managed it," she said one afternoon as we sat in the hospital garden, watching the sunset paint the sky in shades of pink and gold. "The money for the treatment, I mean, you won't tell me where it came from." I squeezed her hand, feeling the weight of all the lies I told, all the lines I crossed. "It doesn't matter where it came from. What matters is that you're getting better. It matters to me," she said quietly. "I know you, Annabelle. I know you wouldn't have been able to afford this on your own. And I know you well enough to know that you'd do anything to save me, even if it meant destroying yourself." She was right, of course. But I couldn't tell her that. Couldn't tell her that her life had been paid for with beautiful lies and carefully crafted deceptions. Couldn't tell her that I'd discovered I was good at being bad, that I found a kind of purpose in Trinity's world of elegant crime. "I'm going to be okay," I said instead. "We're both going to be okay." That even as I said it, I knew it wasn't true. Because 3 days later, Detective Collins knocked on my door. He was younger than I'd expected, with kind eyes and the sort of rumpled appearance that suggested he cared more about solving cases than impressing superiors. He showed me his badge, asked if he could come in, and proceeded to turn my world upside down with polite questions and careful observations. "I'm investigating some irregularities in the art market," he said, settling into my living room chair. Like he had all the time in the world. Specifically, some pieces that had been sold with questionable provenance. My mouth went dry. "I don't know anything about art." "No, that's interesting because your name came up in connection with a vase that was sold at auction last month. French provincial pottery, supposedly from the 18th century. He pulled out a photograph, and there it was, my grandmother's vase, looking innocent and beautiful and absolutely damning. "I inherited that from my grandmother," I said, sticking to the story we'd created. "I needed money for my sister's medical treatment, so I sold it." Detective Collins nodded sympathetically. "I understand. Medical bills can be devastating. It's just that we've had some questions about the piece's authenticity. The buyer contacted us after having it examined by specialists. Marcus Diaz, of course. The bastard had gone to the police after all." "I don't understand," I said, trying to keep my voice steady. "Are you saying it's fake?" "I'm saying we're investigating. And part of that investigation involves looking into the documentation that was provided. Documentation that seems to have been prepared by Trinity Blackwood, who runs an antique shop on Maple Street. The net was closing around us." I could feel it tightening with every word Detective Collins spoke, every sympathetic smile he offered, every careful question he asked. "I'd like you to come down to the station," he said finally, "just to answer a few questions, help us clear this up." I should have asked for a lawyer, should have refused to go, should have called Trinity, should have done any number of things that might have protected us both. Instead, I found myself nodding, agreeing, walking into a trap that had been set the moment we decided to play in Marcus Diaz's world. At the station, Detective Collins was joined by his partner, a hard-faced woman named Detective Martinez, who looked like she'd seen every con in the book and wasn't impressed by any of them. They put me in a small, windowless room and proceeded to take apart my story piece by piece. The problem, Detective Martinez said, spreading photographs across the table, is that your grandmother's face isn't the only questionable piece that's been sold recently. There's a pattern here, Miss Henderson, a pattern of items with fabricated histories being sold at auction. She showed me pictures of paintings, sculptures, decorative objects, all beautiful, all expensive, all accompanied by elaborate documentation that looked authentic to anyone who didn't know what to look for. And in every case, Detective Collins added, the trail leads back to Trinity Blackwood. She seems to be very good at creating convincing paperwork. They knew. They knew everything, or at least enough to destroy us both. I sat in that windowless room staring at the evidence of our crimes and realized that I had a choice to make. I could protect myself, throw Trinity under the bus, claim I'd been an innocent victim of her expertise, or I could protect her, take the fall, and hope that love was worth the price. I want a lawyer, I said finally. Detective Martinez smiled. Smart choice. You're going to need one. They arrested Trinity the next morning. I watched from my living room window as Detective Collins and his partner walked her out of the antique shop in handcuffs, her head held high and her expression defiant. Even in custody, she looked beautiful, dangerous, and unrepentant, and absolutely unbroken. My lawyer was a public defender named Jennifer Walsh, who looked like she'd graduated from law school about 5 minutes ago. She had good intentions and a heavy caseload, and she explained my options with the kind of weary practicality that comes from seeing too many people make too many bad choices. They have documentation, she said, spreading the police file across the table in the courthouse. Conference room, photographs, expert testimony, paper trails that connect you to multiple fraudulent sales. The district attorney is talking about racketeering charges. Racketeering. The word hit me like a physical blow. I thought about Sarah, about the treatment. That was saving her life, about the money that had made it possible. I thought about Trinity, sitting in a cell somewhere, probably planning her next move with the same cool calculation she brought to everything else. How long? I asked. If you're convicted on all charges, 7 to 10 years, maybe more. Jennifer looked up from the file, her expression sympathetic but realistic. But there might be another option. The option was cooperation. The prosecution wanted Trinity more than they wanted me, and they were willing to make a deal. Reduced. Charges, minimal jail time, probation instead of prison. All I had to do was testify against the woman who had saved my sister's life. She's the mastermind, the district attorney explained when I met with him later that day. You were just a desperate woman trying to save her sister, a victim of circumstance who got in over her head. He was offering me a way out, a chance to walk away from this nightmare with my life intact. All I had to do was betray Trinity, paint her as the predator and myself as the prey. It would be easy to do. She was the professional, I was the amateur. She had the expertise, I had the desperation. The narrative practically wrote itself. But when I closed my eyes, I saw Trinity's hands guiding mine as we aged that first document. I heard her voice explaining the subtle art of believable deception. I felt her lips on mine that first night, tasting of champagne and possibility. I need time to think, I said. You have 24 hours, the district attorney replied. After that, the offer expires. I spent that night walking through the city, trying to figure out how I'd gotten here. 6 months ago, I'd been a law-abiding citizen whose biggest crime was occasionally jaywalking. Now I was facing federal charges and contemplating betraying the woman I'd fallen in love with. The irony wasn't lost on me. Trinity had taught me that sometimes survival required flexibility, that sometimes doing the wrong thing was the only way to do the right thing. Now I was faced with the ultimate test of that philosophy. I could cooperate, testify against Trinity, and walk away with my freedom. I could go back to my normal life, watch Sarah recover, pretend that none of this had ever happened. It would be the smart choice, the practical choice, the choice that any rational person would make. Or I could stay loyal to Trinity, face the consequences of our crimes together, and hope that love was stronger than the law. I made my decision at dawn, watching the sun rise over the city from a park bench where Trinity and I had shared coffee and planning sessions. When I walked into the courthouse that morning, I knew what I was going to do. I'm not cooperating, I told the district attorney. I'm not testifying against Trinity Blackwood. He stared at me like I'd lost my mind. Miss Henderson, I don't think you understand the gravity of your situation. I understand perfectly, I interrupted. I understand that I'm going to prison, and I understand that I'm going to deserve it. But I'm not going to betray Trinity to save myself. The trial was a media circus. The prosecution painted Trinity as a master manipulator who had corrupted an innocent woman. The defense argued that we were both victims of a system that made healthcare unaffordable and desperation profitable. The jury listened to expert testimony about forgery techniques and paper aging, about the art market and the thin line between authentication and fraud. I testified in my own defense, but I didn't throw Trinity under the bus. Instead, I told the truth, or as much of it as I could, without making things worse for either of us. I talked about Sarah's illness, about the impossible choice between letting her die and breaking the law to save her. I talked about Trinity's expertise, her passion for her craft, her belief that she was redistributing wealth from those who had too much to those who had too little. Do you regret your actions? The prosecutor asked during cross-examination. I looked at Trinity, sitting at the defense table with her lawyer, watching me with those dark eyes that had seen through all my pretenses from the beginning. I thought about Sarah, healthy and strong, and preparing to go back to college. I thought about the money that had made her recovery possible, the beautiful lies that had become beautiful truths. I regret getting caught, I said finally, but I don't regret saving my sister. The jury deliberated for 2 days. When they returned, they found us both guilty on multiple counts of fraud and conspiracy. The judge sentenced Trinity to 5 years in federal prison. I got 3 years with the possibility of parole after 18 months. As the bailiff led us away in handcuffs, Trinity caught my eye and smiled. Not the predatory smile she'd worn in her shop, not the seductive smile she'd used to draw me into her world, but something softer, something real. Thank you, she mouthed, and I understood. Not just for not betraying her, but for choosing love over self-preservation. For proving that some things were worth the price you paid for them. Federal prison was nothing like I'd expected. The women's facility in Connecticut was more like a boarding school for criminals than the hellscape I'd imagined. I shared a cell with a grandmother who'd embezzled money from her church to pay for her grandson's college tuition. And down the hall lived a former bank manager who'd been stealing from customer accounts to fund her gambling addiction. We were all there for money in one way or another. Money we'd needed, money we'd wanted, money we'd stolen or forged or manipulated to get. And in the strange democracy of incarceration, those distinctions mattered less than you might think. Trinity was in a different facility, a higher security prison 3 states away. But we wrote letters, long rambling epistles that the guards read before passing them on. We couldn't talk about our crimes or our plans for the future, but we could talk about books and art and the small details of institutional life that made the days bearable. I'm teaching a class, Trinity wrote in one letter. Art history, technically, but really it's about seeing. About looking at something and understanding not just what it is, but what it could be. Some of these women have real talent. They just never had anyone to show them how to use it. She was building a new kind of empire, I realized. Not one based on forgery and fraud, but on education and possibility. She was teaching women who had nothing left to lose how to create something beautiful from nothing. I found my own purpose in the prison library, helping other inmates write letters to their families, fill out legal documents, navigate the bureaucracy that controlled every aspect of our lives. I was good at it, good at translating desperation into the kind of language that bureaucrats understood, good at finding the loopholes and technicalities that can mean the difference between seeing your children again or losing them to the system forever. It was a different kind of forgery in its own way, taking broken lives and helping people reshape them into something that looked like redemption. Sarah visited me once a month, driving up from the city with updates about her recovery, her return to school, the life she was building with the time I'd bought her. She never asked about the details of what I'd done, never pressed for explanations I couldn't give. She just held my hand across the prison visiting room table and told me she loved me. The doctors say I'm in complete remission, she said during one visit, her eyes bright with tears. They say if I stay clean for 5 years, I'll be considered cured. 5 years. By then, I'd be out of prison. By then, Trinity would be too. By then, maybe we could figure out what came next. I'm proud of you, I told her, meaning it in ways she'd probably never understand. You fought hard for this? We both did, she replied, and I realized she understood more than I'd given her credit for. You both did. I was released on a Tuesday morning in October, 18 months after the trial. The world outside looked different, somehow sharper, more vivid, like I'd been looking at it through frosted glass, and suddenly someone had cleaned the windows. Trinity wouldn't be eligible for parole for another year, but she wrote that she was proud of me, that she couldn't wait to see what I'd do with my freedom. The halfway house in Hartford was a Victorian mansion that had been converted into apartments for women transitioning back into society. My roommate was a former tax attorney who'd been caught running a Ponzi scheme. We bonded over our shared understanding of how easy it was to cross the line between legal and illegal when you were desperate. Enough. Finding a job with a federal conviction was harder than I'd expected. I applied to dozens of places, got interviews at a few, but as soon as they ran the background check, the offers evaporated. It was Sarah who finally found me work, talking to her professor at the community college where she was finishing her degree. They need someone in the library, she said during one of our weekly dinners. Someone who's good with paperwork and doesn't mind working with people who've made mistakes. The job was perfect. I helped students navigate the labyrinth of financial aid applications, academic appeals, and transfer requirements. I was good at it, good at seeing through the official language to the human need underneath. And slowly, carefully, I began to rebuild my life. One rented a small apartment near the college, bought furniture from thrift stores, adopted a cat from the local shelter. I went to work, came home, cooked dinner, watched television. It was a simple life, a quiet life, a legal life. But every night I wrote to Trinity, and every morning I woke up counting the days until her release. The letter came on a Thursday in March. Trinity's handwriting, but different somehow, more careful, more deliberate. She'd been denied parole, she wrote. Some bureaucratic complication, some technicality that would keep her locked up for another year. I read the letter 3 times before the words sank in. Another year. Another year of visiting rooms and monitored phone calls and letters read by guards. Another year of building a life that felt incomplete without her in it. That night, I drove to Trinity's old antique shop. It had been sold, of course, the inventory liquidated to pay legal fees and court costs. A coffee shop occupied the space. Now, all exposed brick and Edison bulbs, and the kind of artisanal atmosphere that made me want to break something. I stood on the sidewalk, remembering the first time I'd walked through that door. Remembering the woman who'd looked at me and seen not just desperation, but potential. Remembering the hands that had taught me to turn lies into truth. The voice that had showed me how to seduce paper into believing it was old. Annabelle? I turned, and there was Detective Collins, looking older and more tired than I remembered. He was wearing civilian clothes, holding a coffee cup from the shop that had replaced Trinity's World. "Detective," I said, my voice carefully. "Neutral. I'm surprised to see you." "I live in the neighborhood," he said, then paused. "I heard about Trinity's parole denial." "I'm sorry." I studied his face, trying to read the expression there. "Are you sorry, I mean?" He was quiet for a long moment, staring at the storefront that had once been the center of our criminal enterprise. "I've been thinking about your case a lot lately. About the choices you made, the reasons you made them. Having second thoughts about putting us away. Having thoughts about a system that makes people choose between their family's life and their own freedom," he said quietly. "Your sister's doing well, I hear. Back in school, clean bill of health." "She is. That's good. That's really good." He looked at me directly for the first time. "I have a daughter. She's 8 now. And sometimes I think about what I'd do if she was sick, if she needed something I couldn't afford, if the system failed her the way it failed you." I didn't know what to say to that. Detective Collins had been kind during the investigation, professional during the trial, but he'd still been the one to put the handcuffs on. He'd still been the one to take apart our beautiful, elaborate lies. "I'm not saying what you did was right," he continued, "but I'm not saying it was wrong either. I'm saying it was human. And maybe that's enough." He finished his coffee, tossed the cup in a nearby trash can, and started to walk away. Then he stopped, turned back. "There's something else," he said. "Something I probably shouldn't tell you, but I'm going to anyway. Marcus Diaz is in trouble, real trouble. The IRS is investigating him for tax evasion, and it turns out he's been dealing in stolen artifacts for years. Pieces looted from museums, private collections, archaeological sites." My heart started beating faster. "What does that mean?" "It means his credibility as a witness is compromised. It means the prosecution's case against you was built on testimony from a man who's probably going to prison for longer than you did." Detective Collins smiled grimly. "It means Trinity's appeal might have some legs after all." He walked away, leaving me standing on the sidewalk with hope blooming in my chest. Like a flower in concrete, I pulled out my phone and called Trinity's lawyer, a woman named Rebecca Martinez, who'd been fighting for her client's freedom with the kind of passion that made me believe in justice again. "I was just about to call you," she said when I explained what Detective Collins had told me. "I got word this morning that the appellate court agreed to hear Trinity's case. With Marcus Diaz's credibility in question, we might be able to get her conviction overturned. What are the chances?" "Better than they were yesterday," she said. "Better than they've been since the trial." I hung up and looked at the coffee. Shop again at the space where Trinity had taught me that authenticity wasn't about perfection, but about believable imperfection. Where she'd shown me that sometimes the most beautiful things were the ones that weren't quite what they seemed. Maybe that was true about people too. Maybe we were all forgeries in our own way, trying to pass for something we weren't, hoping that love could make our imperfections believable. The appellate court hearing was held in a courthouse that looked like a cathedral, all soaring columns and marble floors, and the kind of architectural grandeur that was designed to make you feel small in the face of justice. I sat in the gallery watching Trinity's lawyer argue her case with the kind of passionate precision that I'd once seen Trinity bring to her forgeries. Your Honors, Rebecca Martinez said, her voice carrying clearly through the courtroom. The defendant was convicted largely on the testimony of Marcus Diaz, a man who has since been revealed to be a criminal of the highest order. His credibility as a witness has been completely undermined by subsequent investigations. The judges asked pointed questions about evidence and precedent, about the standards for overturning convictions based on witness credibility. I watched Trinity through it all, sitting at the defense table in her prison uniform, her back straight, and her attention focused entirely on the proceedings. She looked different after 3 years in prison. Thinner, maybe, more careful. But when she turned and caught my eye, her smile was exactly the same, that mix of mischief and intelligence that had first drawn me into her world. The hearing lasted 2 hours. When it was over, the judges said they'd render their decision within 30 days. Trinity was led away in handcuffs, but not before she mouthed, "Thank you," to me across the courtroom. 23 days later, Rebecca Martinez called me at work. "We won," she said, her voice bright with triumph. The court overturned Trinity's conviction. She'd be released tomorrow. I quit my job that afternoon. Not permanently, I'd worked. Too hard to rebuild my life to throw it away, but I needed a few days to process what was happening. Trinity was coming home. After 3 years of letters and visits and counting down the days, she was finally coming home. I picked her up at the prison gate at 8 in the morning, driving the same route I'd taken for dozens of visits, but feeling like I was traveling to a different planet. Trinity emerged from the institutional building, carrying a cardboard box and wearing civilian clothes that looked strange after years of seeing her in prison uniforms. She was thinner than I remembered, her hair longer, her eyes carrying the kind of wariness that came from years of institutional life. But when she saw me, her face lit up with genuine joy. "Annabelle," she said, and my name in her voice sounded like a prayer. We held each other in the parking lot, not caring about the guards watching from the towers or the other visitors staring at us. She felt solid and real and present in a way that letters and phone calls could never capture. "I missed you," I whispered into her hair. "I missed you too," she replied. "Every day." The drive back to Hartford was quiet, both of us struggling to bridge the gap between the people we'd been when we went to prison and the people we were now. Trinity stared out the window at the passing landscape, taking in the world that had continued without her. "It looks different," she said finally. "Everything looks different." "It is different," I replied. "We're different." She turned to look at me, studying my face with the same intensity she'd once brought to examining antiques. "Are you happy?" she asked. "With the life you've built?" I thought about my apartment, my job, my quiet routine. It was a good life, a legal life, a life that Sarah could be proud of. But it was also incomplete, missing the spark that had made everything else worthwhile. "I'm happy you're here," I said finally. "Everything else we can figure out." Trinity moved into my apartment, and we began the delicate process of learning how to be together again. Prison had changed us both in ways that weren't immediately obvious. She was more careful now, more aware of consequences. I was more grounded, more practical. We were like two instruments that had been retuned, trying to find a harmony that worked with our new keys. She got a job at a used bookstore, a place that specialized in rare and antique volumes. The owner, an elderly man named Robert Chun, knew about her conviction but hired her anyway. "I need someone who understands the difference between authentic and fake," he said when I asked why he'd taken the risk. "Someone who can spot a reproduction from across the room." Trinity has that kind of eye. It was honest work, legal work, but I could see the part of Trinity that missed the excitement of her old life. She'd leaf through auction catalogs with the same intensity she'd once brought to planning forgeries, pointing out pieces that were obviously fake, but selling for ridiculous prices. "Look at this," she said one evening, showing me a listing for a supposed Renaissance painting. The brushwork is all wrong for the period. The composition is textbook 19th century romantic, but it's going to sell for $500,000 because it has the right signature. Does it bother you? I asked. Seeing other people get away with what we went to prison for? Trinity was quiet for a long moment, considering the question. It bothers me that we got caught, she said finally, but it doesn't bother me that we tried. Sarah's alive because we tried. That's worth something. She was right, of course, but I could see the restlessness in her, the part of her that had been born to create beautiful lies and was now confined to identifying them. It was like watching a pianist work as a piano tuner, technically skilled, but not quite fulfilled. The opportunity came in the form of a phone call from Rebecca Martinez. She'd been contacted by a documentary filmmaker who wanted to tell the story of art forgery in America. They were looking for someone who could explain the technical aspects, the psychology of deception, the thin line between restoration and fraud. It would be consulting work, Rebecca explained. Legitimate, well-paid, and completely legal. They want someone who understands the world from the inside. Trinity took the job, and I watched her come alive in a way I hadn't seen since before our arrest. She spent hours on the phone with the filmmakers, explaining the subtleties of her former craft, the dedication it took to create convincing fakes. She was teaching again, sharing her knowledge in a way that was both legal and valuable. I'm thinking about writing a book, she said one night as we lay in bed, her voice soft in the darkness. About the art world, about authentication, about the stories we tell ourselves about what makes something valuable. What kind of book? A memoir, maybe, or a guide to understanding art fraud. Something that could help people recognize when they're being deceived. She paused. Something that could help people understand why someone might choose deception in the first place. I turned to face her, studying her profile in the dim light from the street lamp outside our window. You want to tell our story? I want to tell the truth, she said. About what we did, why we did it, what it cost us. I want people to understand that it's not always about greed or malice. Sometimes it's about love. Sometimes it's about desperation. Sometimes it's about the impossible choices that life forces on you. The idea terrified and thrilled me in equal measure. Telling our story meant reliving it, meant exposing ourselves to judgment and criticism and the possibility that people would see us as criminals rather than people who'd made difficult choices in impossible circumstances. But it also meant taking control of our narrative, telling the story ourselves instead of letting others tell it for us. What would you call it? I asked. Trinity smiled, and I could see the wheels turning in her mind. The Art of Deception. She said, a love story. The book took 2 years to write. Trinity worked on it during her lunch breaks at the bookstore, in the evenings after dinner, on weekends when most people were relaxing. She interviewed other forgers, art dealers, collectors, law enforcement officials. She researched the history of art fraud, the psychology of deception, the economics of the art market, and she wrote about us. About the night we met, about the education she'd given me, about the choices we'd made and the prices we'd paid. She wrote about love and desperation and the thin line between right and wrong. She wrote about a world where beauty was currency and authenticity was negotiable. I read each chapter as she finished it, watching our story take shape on the page. It was strange, seeing our life transformed into narrative, our crimes transformed into a love story. But it was also cathartic, a way of processing everything that had happened to us. The book was published by a small press that specialized in true crime memoirs. The reviews were mostly positive, with critics praising Trinity's insights into the art world and her unflinching honesty about the moral complexities of her former career. A few reviewers criticized her for glamorizing criminal behavior, but most understood what she was really trying to do. Blackwood has written a complex and nuanced examination of the choices we make when the system fails us, wrote one reviewer. This is not a book that asks us to condone fraud, but rather to understand the human circumstances that can lead otherwise decent people to cross lines they never imagined they would cross. The book tour was surreal. Trinity appeared on talk, shows and podcasts in bookstores and libraries, telling our story to audiences who saw her as everything from a criminal mastermind to a folk hero. She was articulate and charming, honest about her crimes, while also making people understand the context that had led to them. "I don't expect people to approve of what I did," she said during one interview, "but I hope they can understand why I did it. I hope they can see that sometimes the choice isn't between right and wrong, but between different kinds of wrong." The book became a bestseller, not because people approved of art forgery, but because they recognized something universal in our story. The impossible choices, the desperate measures, the love that made people do things they never thought they were capable of. Sarah came to the book launch, proud and beautiful and healthy. She'd graduated from college, found a job she loved, started dating a man who made her laugh. She was living the life that our crimes had made possible, and she carried no guilt about it. "I'm proud of you," she told Trinity during the signing. "Both of you. You saved my life, and now you're helping other people understand what that meant." Detective Collins came too, buying a copy of the book and asking Trinity to sign it. He retired from the police force, he told us, and was working as a private investigator specializing in art theft cases. "I learned a lot from your case," he said, "about the complexity of motivation, about the difference between justice and mercy. I try to remember that when I'm working on cases now." Even Marcus Diaz showed up, though he left before the signing started. He was out on bail, awaiting trial for his own crimes. He looked smaller than I remembered, diminished by his fall from grace. Trinity watched him leave, her expression thoughtful. "I almost feel sorry for him," she said. "He was so focused on destroying us that he forgot to cover his own tracks." "Do you regret it?" I asked. "Any of it?" Trinity considered the question, the same one she'd been asked 100 times during interviews and book signings. "I regret that we got caught," she said finally. "I regret that we had to go to prison. I regret that the system is so broken that people have to choose between their family's life and their own freedom." She paused, looking around the bookstore, at the crowd of people who had come to hear our story. "But I don't regret saving Sarah. I don't regret falling in love with you. I don't regret learning that I was capable of more than I ever imagined, even if that more included things I never thought I'd do." 5 years have passed since the book was published. Trinity now runs workshops for law enforcement agencies, teaching them how to identify art forgeries and understand the psychology of fraud. She's considered an expert in her field, consulted by museums and auction houses, respected for her knowledge and her honesty about her past. I finished my degree and now work as a victim's advocate, helping people navigate the legal system when they've been caught in impossible situations. My experience with the criminal justice system, my understanding of how desperation can drive people to make choices they never thought they would make, gives me a unique perspective on the work. Sarah is married now to the man who makes her laugh. They live in California, where she works as a pediatric nurse, helping families dealing with childhood cancer. She sends us pictures of her garden, her travels, her life. She's been cancer-free for 7 years now, and every day of that freedom is a gift that our crimes made possible. We live in a small house outside the city, surrounded by books and genuine antiques that Trinity has acquired through completely legal channels. She's teaching me to restore furniture, to see the beauty in imperfection, to understand that sometimes The most valuable things are the ones that show their age honestly. Look at this, she says one afternoon, running her hand along the surface of a table we're refinishing. You can see where someone set down hot cups, where children did their homework, where life happened. Those marks tell a story. They make it real. I watch her work, noting the way her hands move with the same precision they once brought to creating forgeries. But now she's revealing truth instead of concealing it, bringing out the authentic beauty that was always there beneath the surface. No regrets? I ask the question that has become our private joke. Trinity looks up at me, her eyes bright with mischief and love and the kind of contentment that comes from finding your place in the world. No regrets, she says, not about any of it. She's right, of course. We paid the price for our crimes, faced the consequences of our choices, learned to live with the weight of what we'd done. But we also learned something else, that love could transform even the most elaborate lies into something like truth. The vase sits on our mantelpiece now, the one that started it all. Not the original that was seized as evidence and never returned, but a replica that Trinity created using completely legal methods. It's beautiful in its imperfection, honest in its artifice, valuable not for what it pretends to be, but for what it represents. It represents a choice we made, a risk we took, a love we were willing to go to prison for. It represents the moment when two women decided that sometimes the most authentic thing you can do is create a beautiful lie. And in the end, maybe that's what love is, the willingness to see someone not as they are, but as they could be. The willingness to believe in a story that might not be true, but feels true, sounds true, looks true from the right angle and the right light. The art of deception, it turns out, is also the art of love. And sometimes, if you're very lucky and very careful and very willing to pay the price, you can make both of them real. That's my story. That's how I fell in love with a forger, became a criminal, went to prison, and found a kind of redemption in the honest work of restoration. It's a story about desperate measures and impossible choices, about the thin line between authenticity and fraud, about the price of love and the value of truth. It's also a story about second chances, about the possibility of transformation, about the ways that people can change without losing the essential parts of themselves that made them worth loving in the first place. And if you're wondering whether I'd do it all again, knowing what I know now, understanding the full cost of our beautiful crimes, well, that's a question I hope I never have to answer. But I suspect I already know what the answer would be. Some things are worth the price you pay for them. Some loves are worth the risk of damnation. And sometimes, when the world forces you to choose between your family's life and your own freedom, the only authentic choice is the one that feels like a forgery. That's the truth, as honest as I can make it. And unlike everything else in this story, it's the one thing I guarantee is real.